صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألا إن أولياء الله لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون الذين آمنوا وكانوا يتقون لهم البشرى في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة لا تبديل لكلمات الله ذلك هو الفوز العظيم. ولا يحزنك قولهم إن العزة لله جميعا هو السميع العليم. ألا إن لله من في السماوات ومن في الأرض وما يتبع الذين يدعون من دون الله شركاء إن يتبعون إلا الظن وإن هم إلا يخرصون. هو الذي جعل لكم الليل لتسكنوا فيه والنهار مبصرا إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يسمعون. قالوا اتخذ الله ولدا سبحانه هو الغني له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض إن عندكم من سلطان بهذا أتقولون على الله ما لا تعلمون. قل إن الذين يفترون على الله الكذب لا يفلحون متاع في الدنيا ثم إلينا مرجعهم ثم نذيقهم العذاب الشديد بما كانوا يكفرون. واتل عليهم نبأ نوح إذ قال لقومه يا قوم إن كان كبر عليكم مقامي وتذكيري بآيات الله فعلى الله توكلت فأجمعوا أمركم وشركاءكم ثم لا يكن أمركم عليكم غمة ثم اقضوا إلي ولا تنظرون. فإن توليتم فما سألتكم من أجر إن أجري إلا على الله وأمرت أن أكون من المسلمين. فكذبوه فنجيناه ومن معه في الفلك وجعلناهم خلائف وأغرقنا الذين كذبوا بآياتنا فانظر كيف كان عاقبة المنذرين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات.
Two lines in praise of Mullah Abbas alayhi salam, followed by a mercy of Bibi Sakina. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. इतनी भर जाए इन आँखों में ज़ियाए अब्बास, इतनी भर जाए इन आँखों में ज़ियाए अब्बास, मुझको कोई ना नजर आए सिवाए अब्बास, इतनी भर जाए। सल्लु अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद। मेरी सकीना सो जा, आजा असग़र की जगह, मेरी सकीना सो जा, जो तुझे खौफ है शायद मैं उसे कम कर दूं, आज आँखों पे तेरे नादे अली दम कर दूं, दूर क्यों बैठी है आ मेरी सकीना सो जा, आजा असग़र की जगह, मेरी सकीना सो जा। बाप के सीने पे आदत है तुझे सोने की, मेरी गोदी तेरे काबिल तो नहीं है, फिर भी है मेरे दिल की सदा, मेरी सकीना सो जाए, आजा असग़र की जगह, मेरी सकीना सो जा। 4 बरसों में ना ज़हमत दी कभी तूने मुझे, अपनी खिदमत का मुझे आज तो मौका दे दे, होगा एहसान तेरा, मेरी सकीना सो जा, आजा असग़र की जगह, मेरी सकीना सो जा। कैद खाने में जो आ जाएंगे तेरे बाबा, खुद उठा दूंगी तुझे शाना हिला कर तेरा, अच्छा कुछ देर ज़रा मेरी सकीना सो जा, आजा असग़र की जगह, मेरी सकीना सो जा। मुझसे देखा नहीं जाता ये तेरा दर्द जिगर, ये बताते हुए अच्छा तो नहीं लगता मगर, अब न आएंगे चचा मेरी सकीना सो जाए, आजा असग़र की जगह मेरी सकीना सो जाए। साबिरों का ये करीना तो नहीं है बीबी, ये है परदेस मदीना तो नहीं है बीबी। करके बस शुक्र खुदा मेरी सकीना सो जा, आजा असग़र की जगह मेरी सकीना सो जा। इस तरह सोई तकल्लुम वो यतीमा बीबी, माँ उठाती रही उठी ना सकीना बीबी। फिर ना बानों ने कहा मेरी सकीना सो जा, आजा असग़र की जगह मेरी सकीना सो जा। सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि मोहम्मद।
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، ببركة الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، ورد عن إمامنا أبي عبد الله الحسين عليه السلام: يا شيعة آل أبي سفيان، إن لم يكن لكم دين وكنتم لا تخافون المعاد، فكونوا أحرارا في دنياكم. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. صل على محمد وعلى محمد. وصدق الإمام عليه السلام. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When we examine the episode of what happened and what transpired on the 10th of Muharram, there's a lot of baggage in terms of history, a lot of history that emanated decades before. And what emanated on the 10th of Muharram was a grudge or a feud that existed between the two tribes, Number one, the Bani Hashim, and number two, the Bani Umayyah. Now, how you examine history changes your perspective as to what type of a movement Karbala was. So when you look into history and you look at, for example, some of the historians that approach this particular battle that took place on the 10th of Muharram, there are those who opine by saying that this was a feud, a tribal feud that existed between two tribes. And this is often the narrative that is proposed, that this was a tribal feud, a tribal war between the two tribes, the Bani Hashim and the Bani Umayyah. Whereas when you approach it from a religious perspective, very interestingly, if you wear the lens of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam and you observe the events that led to Karbala and the 10th of Muharram, you realize that this was more of a divine movement, a movement to preserve the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alih. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. In fact, you'll find that there's a lot of back and forth amongst the scholars, especially when discussing this particular area. What was the movement or the essence behind the movement of Karbala? But what's interesting is if you refer to the statement of Imam al-Hussein on the 10th of Muharram, and this happens just before he is martyred, just before he is killed, he issues a statement towards the Kufans, towards his enemies. And he doesn't refer to them as, O people of Kufa. He refers to them, O followers of Abi Sufyan. They were Shia, but who were they Shias to? The family of Abi Sufyan. So he refers to them as the followers of Abi Sufyan. And then he says to them, if you do not ascribe to a religion, which very interesting words, he says, if you do not ascribe to a religion and you have no fear for the day of judgment, then at least be free in your world. Live your life as free men. And then he says, go back to how your ancestors would behave if you truly call yourselves Arabs. You claim to be Arabs. Arabs, in nature, in those times, of course, they would follow the traditions that were passed down from one generation to another. So when you approach Karbala from a different perspective, you realize that it broke all of the traditions that were sacrament during the period of Jahiliyyah. Amongst them, for example, the fight took place in Muharram. Muharram was a sacred month. No blood would be shed during the month of Muharram. But this tradition, which was sacrosanct in itself, was destroyed in its essence. And of course, other aspects as well. But you realize that Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, the way he refers to his enemies, it highlights for us the theological perception that he had developed towards the people of Kufa, towards his enemies. Even part of this particular segment that he mentions, there is a strong akhlaqi perspective as well that he's trying to tap into. If they are people with no values and no principles and no disciplines, then at least the Imam would tap into them at a human level. But even then, that doesn't work. But the Imam shows and he administers the hujjah upon them. So when you approach the Battle of Karbala from the perspective of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, very interestingly, despite the variations of different opinions offered by the ulama as to what type of a movement it was, it's necessary that we refer to the words of the Imam himself. The will that he leaves behind, the wasiyah that he leaves behind for Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. He mentions very clearly, he says, Inni lam akhruj ashiran wala batran wala mufsidan wala zaliman. He says, the movement that I am leading, this revolution against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, is not with the purpose of causing fasad or dissension. It's not with the purpose of being a zalim, an oppressor. It's not with the purpose of preserving my ego. But rather, it is for the purpose, the objective is to preserve the sanctity of the message of Rasulullah. He says, إنما خرجت لطلب الإصلاح في أمتي جد رسول الله. It was to preserve the sacrosanct message of Rasulullah, to preserve his sanctity and to revive the message that had died, that was dead for a very long time. So from a very narrow perspective, Imam Hussein alayhi salam approaches this particular movement from a divine perspective, that there is more to it than just the feud between two tribes. When you approach it from the other perspective, imagine you're wearing the lens of the Bani Umayyah. Their purpose or their objective of what transpired on the 10th of Muharram was purely vengeance. And it was nothing more than that and nothing less. It was to deliver revenge for what had happened to them decades prior. So what form of revenge are we talking about? Revenge manifested in two ways. Number one, submission and number two, bloodshed. When we speak about bloodshed, we refer to what happened in the Battle of Badr. The Battle of Badr was very significant in allowing all of this to transpire. It acted as a prelude to what happened on the 10th of Muharram. In the Battle of Badr, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam killed 3 enemies, 3 individuals. One of them was Utbah, one of them was Walid ibn Utbah, and the third was Hamdala. As far as Utbah is concerned, he was the father of Hind, the grandfather of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Again, a very prominent figure amongst the tribe of the Bani Umayyah, a person who had great power. Walid ibn Utbah, they say he was one of those who could read and write. He was a great poet. He was the one who used to challenge the Holy Prophet, and the Prophet would respond by the ayats of the Holy Quran, and so on and so forth. Walid ibn Utbah was the son of Utbah. So he was the maternal uncle of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Third, Hamdala was the brother of Muawiyah. So you got 3 prominent members or figures amongst the Bani Umayyah who were killed single-handedly by the hands of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So when you understand this, you see when blood is shed in your tribe, we're living in the time of Jahiliyyah. If blood is shed, people in your own tribe are killed, that demands that blood is shed from the opposing tribe. Revenge is sought by shedding blood. So this was the first manifestation. In fact, if you read the sermons or some of the letters of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam when he responds to Muawiyah, it got to a stage in history, it got to a stage where Muawiyah began to threaten the Imam by the use of the sword. So the Imam responds back to him. He says, "Are you really threatening me with the sword?" He says, "When's the last time you saw a sword in the hands of a Hashimi and he ran away from battle?" He says, "Do you not know? Should I remind you of what happened in Badr? Your grandfather he saw his fate under my sword. Likewise your uncle, likewise your brother." He says, threatening me through violence and fighting and through the sword, you think it's going to do anything to me? So the Imam alayhi salam, at times, he would strike back at Muawiyah through words by reminding him what happened in Badr. So Badr, what happened was quite significant, especially these 3 figures who were killed. This was something that changed the whole dimensions of how the Bani Umayyah were treating the Bani Hashim. Thus succeeding events in history, Battle of Uhud, Khandaq, Khaybar, and all of these different battles, you think they were fighting the Muslims to preserve polytheism? Do you think that they had such respect for polytheism that they were willing to give their lives because of it? It was because of revenge. All of these succeeding battles took place because they wanted to seek revenge for what had happened to them in the Battle of Badr. So this was the first manifestation, blood for blood. That's the understanding of vengeance. From a second perspective, it was through submission. Submission because of what had happened in the 8th year of Hijrah. What happened in the 8th year of Hijrah? The conquest of Mecca. Rasulullah enters Mecca without a single drop of blood being shed. He was able to humiliate the Bani Umayyah, render them into submission, so that they were willing to transfer the power of authority. This form of submission was so humiliating for the Bani Umayyah, it was not forgotten. This transference of power was humiliating for them, and they sought revenge for that too. So when we speak about revenge from the perspective of the Bani Umayyah, it manifested in these 2 ways. Number 1, through bloodshed of what happened in Badr. Number 2, because of the conquest of Mecca, where there was a transference of power from the Bani Umayyah to the Bani Hashim, specifically the Holy Prophet of Islam. With regards to Muawiyah, when he became the Caliph of the Muslim Ummah, again, he didn't start off as the Caliph of the Muslim Ummah. Initially, he became the governor of Syria, and slowly his power began to develop, it began to grow. He became the governor of Syria at the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab. It was then more heightened towards the time of Uthman ibn Affan. When the Imam takes on the power of Caliphate, Muawiyah is now a considerable threat. So the Battle of Siffin takes place. You see, Muawiyah, when we discuss his nature, when we discuss his characteristics, he was a very smart man. Smart, but not in a good way. He was very cunning. That's the definition of someone who is smart, in a very negative way. He was cunning. He was a very strategic person. He knew how to get things done, but it involved sin. It involved, for example, the violation of human rights and so on and so forth. So he knew how to get things done, but he never used the appropriate methods of getting things done. Muawiyah was smart. When the Battle of Siffin took place, when he knew that he was on the verge of losing, what was the one thing that he did? He took the copies of the Quran and he placed them on top of the spears. See, that's a very smart, cunning, negative, very negative thing to do, but smart, because it forced the Imam to stop fighting. Otherwise, the Imam would have completely destroyed the army of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. When Imam saw the copies of the Quran being placed on top of the spears, now he couldn't carry on fighting, because now you're questioning the hurmah of the Quran. You can't attack people who are holding the Quran on their spears or in their hands. That's not how the Imam observes his principles. So an arbitration was conducted. The Imam was forced into arbitration. They say that when the Imam returned to Kufa, the people in his own army began to question the authority of Amir al-Mu'mineen. They began to praise Muawiyah and say, look, Muawiyah was very smart in this particular event. He was very strategic. He forced the Imam to stop the battle. When the Imam heard that people were now praising Muawiyah, immediately he sits on the minbar and he delivers a sermon. He says, Wallahi ma Muawiyatu adha minni. Do not think, even for a moment, that Muawiyah is more cunning than I am. The only difference is, وَلَكِنَّهُ يَغْدِرُ وَيَفْجُرُ. This is a person of sin and licentiousness. This is a person who has no boundaries. This is a person who has no ethics, no morality. He doesn't observe any principles. There are no disciplines that he observes. He will make sure that things transpire the way he wants to, and he will break every law there is under the sun. There are no red lines for Muawiyah. With regards to myself, there are boundaries. There are certain things that I cannot do. Don't think that Muawiyah is more cunning than I am. I am cunning, but there are boundaries that I follow, and I choose not to be cunning. As in, I can do certain things that are worse than Muawiyah, but there are certain disciplines and there are certain concepts that I have made an obligation on myself to preserve. That's the difference between Muawiyah and Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. So Muawiyah, from a political perspective, was very smart. When Yazid comes into power, Yazid, you could describe him as a child in the seat of a throne. Muawiyah even warned him. But again, he went against the advice of his father, and he went towards Karbala, and he did what he did in Karbala. I'll come to this in a moment. They say when Muawiyah now finishes the Battle of Siffin, the Battle of Siffin is over. When Imam Hassan alayhi salam becomes the caliphate, he forces the Imam alayhi salam into a peace treaty. Yes, we've all heard about this, the peace treaty between Imam Hassan alayhi salam and Muawiyah. Now again, from an outside perspective, when you approach this peace treaty, you come to the conclusion that Imam Hassan alayhi salam lost the battle. That's the outside perspective. He was forced into the peace treaty. The Imam, Muawiyah, proposed the peace treaty and the Imam signed it, which means that the Imam lost. Again, you have to realize the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, when they deal with their enemies, they're always 10 steps ahead. Today, if you want to speak about Muawiyah and what type of a character he was, if you want to expose his hypocrisy, you always refer to the peace treaty of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. Imam Hassan, he was forward-thinking, Ahlul Basair. Yes, he was from those who had an insight. He was playing the long game. Today, 1400 years later, if we look at the conditions that the Imam placed within the peace treaty, we realize that Muawiyah broke each and every single condition. He violated all of the conditions that were stipulated by Imam Hassan. Amongst them, he killed some of the prominent characters, believers. Amongst them, the hurmah towards the people of Medina and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and so on and so forth. It exposes Muawiyah entirely from A to Z. But the question now is, why does Muawiyah propose the peace treaty? Imam Hassan, in that specific battle, he had lost his followers. His governor transfers, his own general transfers his position. He betrays the Imam alayhi salam and joins the camp of Muawiyah. The Imam had no one around him. He had the Khawarij who were part of his army as well, who wanted to kill the Imam. The Imam did not have a formidable army to fight Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Muawiyah in that position could have killed Imam Hassan alayhi salam and killed his loyal followers and supporters. He had that power. But he proposes the peace treaty. Why does he propose the peace treaty? Because this was revenge of what had happened in the conquest of Mecca. In the conquest of Mecca, what happened? There was a transference of authority, transference of leadership. Yes? Now, the tides had changed. Muawiyah saw that the Imam was forced into a position where he would transfer his authority to himself. He proposes the peace treaty, the Imam signs the peace treaty, the authority of the caliphate is transferred from the hands of Imam Hassan alayhi salam towards Muawiyah. With regards to what happened in the conquest of Mecca, the peace treaty of Imam Hassan was a form of revenge. What happened in Badr, how did that manifest as revenge? Well, first of all, you have the assassination of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Again, strategic. Muawiyah was strategic. He planned the assassination of the Imam alayhi salam very meticulously. That he was struck when people were praying, for example, when it's, very busy, that people don't know what's going on. It doesn't happen as you would expect in a battle, for example. There's no formal battle taking place where the Imam alayhi salam is killed. Likewise, Imam Hassan, secretly, privately in his own home by his own wife, those who were close to Imam Hassan, he was poisoned. It wasn't open and public as you would think. With regards to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Muawiyah did not have the chance to even get to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Muawiyah was now on the verge of leaving this world. So when he dies, he turns to his son and he then gives his wasiyah. He advises his son. He says, Yazid, listen to me. There are 4 individuals in the whole of the Muslim empire you should be wary about. Be careful about them. Don't be haste. Don't be rash when you come towards them and in dealing with them. With regards to the people of Syria, they're this type, you should behave with them in this way, give them this, give them that. With regards to the Bani Umayyah, look after them, so on and so forth. He mentions all different types of groups, but then he says these 4 individuals, be very, very careful about them. Abdurrahman, the son of Abu Bakr. You had, for example, Abdullah ibn Umar, and Abdullah ibn Zubair, and of course, Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. When he speaks about the Imam, he says, be very, very careful about him. He is from the lineage of Rasulullah. It's very ironic advice that he gives. Sometimes some of the wise advices comes just before we leave this world. He says, forgive or overlook if he wishes to rise against you. Think strategically when dealing with him. This was the essence of the advice that Muawiyah gave to his son Yazid. Be very, very strategic when you interact with Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. He's not a normal human being. When Yazid comes into power, what's the first thing he demands? Bay'at. When he knows that, and he knows that bay'at is not going to come from Imam Hussein alayhi salam. The way Imam Hussein alayhi salam was dealing with Muawiyah just before Muawiyah passed, just before Muawiyah died, you realize that the Imam alayhi salam had no intentions of giving bay'at. Yazid knew of this. The follow-up was execution. Privately, as his father would do, not at all. This led towards Karbala. Even if it's done in broad daylight, in public, it has to be done. Execution of the Imam alayhi salam as a form of revenge of what had happened in the Battle of Badr. That's why they say when the head of the Imam alayhi salam was sent to Yazid, he was now celebrating. He said, I wish my forefathers were here to see how victorious I am. It was all about revenge. And the culmination of that revenge transpired or was seen. It materialized on the 10th of Muharram. So the Imam alayhi salam, very interestingly, when he observes the attitude of his enemies, he turns to them, he says, Ya ala Abi Sufyan. You're now involved, you're now affiliated with this tribal feud. And then he goes on to say, he says that if you do not see yourself as those ascribed to a religion, very interesting words, huh? The Imam doesn't even consider them as people who are considered to be Muslims. He doesn't even see them as Muslims. He sees them as those who are without religion. Today, people are questioning whether Yazid was right or Imam Hussein was right in terms of this particular battle. Imam Hussein, in his own words, he says that they are not even considered to be Muslims. He refers to them as the followers of Abi Sufyan, not the followers of Umar ibn Sa'd. Umar ibn Sa'd was well older in comparison to Yazid, in comparison to Ibn Ziyad and so on and so forth. He was an elder. He was a scholar amongst the Muslim community. He doesn't refer to them, oh, followers of Ibn Sa'd. Or, for example, O followers of Ibn Ziyad, O followers of Yazid, O followers of Muawiyah, O followers of Ali Abi Sufyan. There is an ideology that these individuals, that this tribe ascribes to, which is away from the religion, but you have affiliated with that same ideology. And then he says that if you do not ascribe to a religion, then be free in this world. Be free in your own worlds. That's a very interesting statement that the Imam makes. Be free. You know, when you refer to the Quran, the ethos of the Quran, no human being is free. Not a single human being is designed to be free. We're all designed to be slaves. We are all innately designed to be slaves. Islam says that you should become the slave of Allah. The moment you become the slave of Allah, you have become free. You have liberated yourself. Or you can become slaves of others, or you can become slaves of your own desires. But that choice is in your hands. He says that if you do not ascribe to a religion, if you do not seek liberation and freedom by becoming slaves of Allah, then at least be free in your world. The worst thing that you can become is to become slaves of the Bani Umayyah. As far as akhirah is concerned, you've lost akhirah. There's no shadow of a doubt in that. For all the crimes that you've committed since the morning, you have lost akhirah. But at least do not lose dunya. Because the moment you become slaves of the Bani Umayyah, you will lose both dunya as well as in akhirah. When you look at all of the executioners on the 10th of Muharram, none of them lived long to see their rewards. The 10 horsemen who trampled on the body of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. They say, the narrations, plenty of them mention that they were then taken to Ibn Ziyad. They stood in front of Ibn Ziyad. Ibn Ziyad asked them, what did you do? They said, we trampled on the body of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. The narration mentions that Ibn Ziyad rewarded them with petty cash. He gave them a few dinars here and there and said, here, this is your reward. Such a great crime recompensed with something very little. They lost dunya as well as in akhirah. The Imam was warning them, be free in your world. At least be free. Do not ascribe to become slaves of the Bani Umayyah. You can do better than this. And then he says to them, and this is very interesting as well, he says that if you claim to be Arabs, then behave the way the Arabs would behave. Upon which Shimr ibn Dhul-Joshan responds to the Imam alayhi salam. He says, O son of Fatima, what do you mean by these words? The name of Fatima alayhi salam is used, but it's used with such levels of jealousy. Like it means nothing, like it carries no weight. This is how he refers to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He says, what do you mean by these words? The Imam responds, again, for Shimr to ask a question, it shows that Shimr was completely oblivious as to what the Imam is referring to. What tradition are you referring to? The Imam replies, he says, I am the one fighting with you. My women have nothing to do with you. Tell your men to not approach my women, the sanctity of my household. And then Shimr replies, he says, I'll see that you get that. But then just a few moments later, you find the men attacking the tents of the women. Where was the sanctity of the haram of Rasulullah? The Imam alayhi salam highlights a very important point. If these are people without principles, if these are people without discipline, if these are people without morality, how do you tap into them? How do you communicate with someone where you have standards but they don't have standards? The Imam talks to them about the sanctity of his women, and the way he treats his women, it teaches us men how to treat our women. Innately, a man is designed to be protective. We have to be protective over the ones that we love. And naturally, women and children are dependent on us. The most fulfilling aspect of being a man is when you are able to take care of others. And Abi Abdullah alayhi salam shows this on the 10th of Muharram. How protective he was over his women and his children. You know, when I hear cases of domestic abuse, that's ajib, it's gharib. Because it goes against the very nature of what it is to be a man. When you hear about divorces, the mother is looking after the children, the husband nowhere to be seen, he's disappeared. Doesn't financially provide for his children. Again, it's very gharib. If you have people who are dependent on you, even though you may not be living with them, it is still your responsibility to fulfill the obligation. It goes against the very nature of being a man. Abi Abdullah alayhi salam on the 10th of Muharram, he enters the river, the Furat. When he enters the Furat, he looks at his horse and he says, أنت عطشان وأنا العطشان فلا أشرب حتى تشرب. He says, I can see that you're thirsty, but I'm thirsty as well, and I will not drink until you drink. The narration says the horse raises its head away from the water. The narrator, he says, it's as if the horse understood the words of the Imam alayhi salam. The horse did understand the words of the Imam alayhi salam. He takes the water in his hands, he lifts it to his mouth, his lips. As he is on the verge of drinking, as he is about to take the sip of water, so one of the enemies approaches from behind him, and he says to him, Ya Aba Abdullah, you taste the coolness of the water when the sanctity of your women is being abused, is being violated. Immediately, without any thought, the Imam throws away the water, he hastens, he rushes back to the tents. When he reaches his women, he sees that they are all protected, there is no one there to harm them. The man had lied to make sure that the Imam doesn't drink anything from the Furat. And then he embraces them. This was known as the second farewell. The Imam embraces them. And then he says to them, he says, "Ista'iddu bil bala." Prepare yourselves for bala that is to come. See, this was the pain of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. On the one hand, yes, you had the emotional, physical pain that he went through by losing his son, his nephews, and so on and so forth. But then from a different perspective, the pain to see that his women will be treated in such a way, that was even more. The destruction of the sanctity of his household. He tells them, prepare for bala that is to come. Allah will make sure that your enemies are punished through various kinds of punishments, and in turn He will reward you with a variation of rewards and bliss and happiness. It says, do not utter anything through your tongues that can lower your status. This is the trade-off. Allah will give you more in reward, but do not complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do not lower your status by saying anything against Allah. He advises them. Then he goes back into battle. And when he goes back into battle, then of course the narration mentions that he is killed. Then what happens immediately after is a tragedy in itself. They promised the Imam alayhi salam that the women will not be touched, but as soon as the Imam is killed, as soon as the head is severed, they ran towards the women. They began charging and competing with one another in approaching the women. The earrings were snatched. The anklets were taken away. Fatima, the daughter of Abi Abdullah, as she sees the abuser approaching her, she sees that he's crying. She asks him, why are you crying? He replies, this is the haram, this is the sanctity of Rasulullah that I am abusing. So she responds, she says, why are you doing it then? She says, if I don't do it, someone else will. If I do not take what belongs to you, then someone else will come and take away your belongings. We find that Da'bal, when he sits with Imam al-Radha alayhi salam, he recites a series of couplets of poems and so on and so forth. After, when he leaves, they approached him. They said to him, Ya Da'bal, which line was difficult for Imam al-Radha alayhi salam to hear? Da'bal says, when I read this particular line, the Imam broke into tears. It's as if his heart was broken. They asked him, which line was it? He says, when I began to recite Banatu Ziyadin fil qusuri masunatun وآل رسول الله في الفلوات. When the women were taken towards the courthouse of Ibn Ziyad, the daughters and the women of Ibn Ziyad are well protected. But the family of Rasulullah, paraded as prisoners. He says, when I mention this line, Imam al-Radha, he breaks into tears and he laments loudly. Abi Makhnaf mentions a narration. He says that a man came and told me about this particular narration. The man says, when I entered the streets of Kufa, I saw that people had abandoned the markets, the shops were closed. When I saw the women, their clothes were torn, and tears were streaming down their faces. So I approached an old man. I said to him, "Oh man, I see that there are people who are lamenting and people who are celebrating. Is this a day of celebration?" The man took me by the hands and took me into an alleyway. Then he said, "Today is no day of celebration, for a group have been killed and a group have been victorious." He says, "Who's been killed?" He says, "The family of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam have been killed in the lands of Karbala, and the family or the army of Ibn Ziyad have emerged victorious." Then the man, he breaks into tears and he laments loudly as he continues to talk. He says, "As he continued, all I could hear was trumpets being sounded by the gates of Kufa. When I came out and I saw a group, a caravan entering the streets of Kufa. All I could see was the head of Abu Abdullah. All I could see was the head of Abu Abdullah on top of a spear being waved around, and the banners were being raised. Then I saw the light emanating from his face. Then I saw a young man sitting on a camel without a saddle, and his thighs were drenched in blood. Then I came to know this was Ali ibn al-Hussein alayhi salam. Then I saw a slave woman on top of a camel without a saddle. I inquired, "Who is this woman?" They told me, "This is Kulthum." At this moment, Kulthum, she turns to the people of Kufa. She says, "O people of Kufa, do you not have shame? Are you not ashamed in front of Allah and His Messenger that you gaze upon the women of His household while they are in this state?" The women, when they saw the children, they could see the signs of starvation on their faces. They would approach the children, give them bread and dates and nuts and all of these small things, upon which Kulthum and Zainab would take them and throw them back. And Zainab and Kulthum both would say, "Do you not know that sadaqah is haram on the family of Rasulullah?" Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.
Ya Hussein, 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 Ya Hussein. बाबा आपके बाद कयामत थे वो दिन जो गुजारे थे, शिमर ने कानों से दुर्चीने और तमाचे मारे थे। इंसानों के रूप में थे हैवान जो दुश्मन सारे थे, हैवान जो दुश्मन सारे थे। एक रसन में बंदे पुपी के बाजू थे और मेरा गला, ऐ बाबा जानम, ऐ बाबा जानम, बाबा जानम, ऐ बाबा जानम, जानम बेकस हो और बेबस हो, मैं शेर खुदा की पोती हूँ। आपके सीने पे सोती थी, अब महती में सोती हूँ। कोई नहीं जो आंसू पहुँचे, कब्र में भी मैं रोती हूँ, कब्र में भी मैं रोती। याद आता है तर पाता है नहर पे जाना अम्मू का, ऐ बाबा जाना नाम, ऐ बाबा जाना जाना, ऐ बाबा जाना नाम। नन्हे असगर को अम्मा ने कितने प्यार से पाला था, इसके दम से घर में हमारे खुशियाँ और उजाला था। तीर गले में लगते ही बाबा ने उसे संभाला था, बाबा ने उसे संभाला था। असगर वीराने में असगर वीराने में घबराया तो कौन संभालेगा, ऐ बाबा जानम, ऐ बाबा जानम, ऐ बाबा जानम जानम। या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन। सलवात अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद।
لبيك يا حسين. It's Salah time.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن عليًا ولي الله أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين وإمام المتقين عليا حجة الله هيا على الصلاة هيا على الصلاة هيا على الفلاح هيا على الفلاح هيا على خير العمل هيا على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أرأيت الذي يكذب بالدين فذلك الذي يدع اليتيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين. فويل للمصلين الذين هم عن صلاتهم ساهون الذين هم يراءون ويمنعون الماءون. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. كذلك الله ربي. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بحول الله وقوته. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر، الله أكبر، الله أكبر.
لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. After Isha dua, inshallah, we'll have announcement and ziyarat, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليك أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليك أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك موجبات رحمتك وعزائم مغفرتك والنجاة من النار من كل بلية والفوز بالجنة والرضوان في دار السلام وجوار نبيك محمد عليه وآله السلام. اللهم ما بنا من نعمة فمنك لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر.
الله أكبر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. كذلك الله ربي. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بحول الله وقوته. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم يا لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر.
الله أكبر.
الله أكبر.
لا إله إلا الله.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل.
محمد وآل محمد صلوات. صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. بحق ابا عبداللہ الحسین. اپنا جے بھائیو بہنوں بچاؤ بیمار ہوئے اپنے دعا کرے کہ اللہ کا بدائن شفا دے بدائنی تکلیف دور تھائے આપણા આલિમો મરજા મોમિનીન ને મોમિનાત દુનિયામાં જ્યાં બી હોય યા અલ્લાહ તું આ લોકોને હિફ્ઝો અમાનમાં રાખ અમારી બધી હાજતો પૂરી કર અમારા ઇલ્મમાં વધારો કર એવી દુઆ સાથે આપણે બધા સાથે 5 ફેરે અમ્મા યુજીબુ પડીએ અઉઝુ બિલ્લાહિ મિનશ શૈતાનિર રજીમ બિસ્મિલ્લાહિર રહમાનિર રહીમ أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 سورة فاتحة شفاء المرضى ودفن البلاء
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليك أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليك أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام وأتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم إنه ليس لي علم بموضع رزقي وإنما أطلبه بخطرات تخطر على قلبي فأجول في طلبه البلدان فأنا فيما أنا طالب كالحيران لا أدري أفي سهل هو أم في جبل أم في أرض أم في سماء أم في بر أم في بحر وعلى يدي من ومن قبل من وقد علمت أن علمه عندك وأسبابه بيدك وأنت الذي تقسمه بلطفك وتسببه برحمتك اللهم فصل على محمد وآله واجعل يا ربي رزقك لي واسعا ومطلبه سهلا ومأخذه قريبا ولا تعنني بطلب ما لم تقدر لي فيه رزقا فإنك غني عن عذابي وأنا فقير إلى رحمتك فصل على محمد وآله وجد على عبدك بفضلك إنك ذو فضل عظيم
Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Few announcements. Monday 7th of August, 10th eve of after Ashura 1445. Tomorrow Tuesday 8th of August is the 10th day after Ashura. Ladies morning majlis at 10 a.m. with Quran. Majlis in Urdu by Zakia Batul Najafi. Thursday 10th of August, Jumeirah program will start at 8 p.m. with Surah Yasin, Majlis by Shaykh Anwar Jaffer. Friday 11th of August, Juma Khutbah at 11 p.m. by Shaykh Anwar Jaffer. Sunday 13th August is the Shahadat day of Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Ladies morning Majlis at 10 a.m. with Quran. Urdu Majlis by Zakira Fatma Saria. Men program for ladies and gents on Sunday 13th will start at 6:45 p.m. with Quran, Majlis by Sheikh Ali Hussain Datu. That's the end of the announcements. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.
زيارة السلام عليك يا رسول الله السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله عليك مني جميعا سلام الله. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولاي يا غريب الغربة سلطان أبا الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا، كن شفيعنا وشفيع والدينا في يوم الجزاء ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا حجة الله يا ابن الحسن يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم كن لوليك حجة ابن الحسن. برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.
Muhammad wa alayhi Muhammad salawat. We have some sad news, death announcement. Please recite Surah Fatiha for Mahroom Al-Hajj Muhammad Wali Muhammad Nanji Parwana. He passed away in Mombasa yesterday and was buried today. Al-Fatiha. Bismillah.